I want to preface this with saying I'm not a military analyst. I'm just some guy on the internet, and I like to talk about stuff that interests me. So, take what I'm about to say with it, with that in mind. But I think that the missile attack on Lviv or Lvov or Lvov or Lemberg, whatever you want to call it, is foreshadowing, or maybe it's an indication. Foreshadowing might be the wrong term. It's an indication that the Russian sentiment, I think, is changing. This is something that I have, I've kind of been fearing more the last week or so. As someone who doesn't really have a dog in this fight, I don't care who wins or loses. I just, I'd like things to stop. I'd like people to stop dying. I don't like wars. That's just me. So I'm a pretty neutral observer when it comes to this stuff. And I think that the Russians smell blood in the water. I think at this point, they can see light at the end of the tunnel, and they are going to be less careful moving forward and less restrained, put it that way. I think that the intention of this strike on the airport in Lviv is to show the Ukrainians that Russia can reach out and touch them anywhere that they are in the country. I think they're trying to say that the front line is not just at the front line. We can attack anywhere we want, and you're completely at our mercy, which in due time, Ukraine will be completely at Russia's mercy, because the negotiations are not going to get anywhere. Every day that goes by, or I should say at least every week or so, Russia has less and less reason to negotiate with the Ukrainians, and more reason to demand an unconditional surrender and dictate the terms of peace themselves. As this war drags on, the negotiating position of the Ukrainians gets worse and worse. And so therefore, they're going to have to offer more and more concessions to the Russians in order to end the war. But as I finally lamented yesterday, I think it was, and as some people like Gonzalo Lira, who are in the country, have been saying for a while, the Russians are, we think, past the point of willing to accept a negotiation. Like I said, they smell the blood in the water, and they're going to take what they want. And so even though at the start of this war, the most expanded map I could think of territory that the Russians were going to try and, occupy and carve out for their sphere of influence, in Ukraine, the biggest map, the most aggressive map that I was considering in my head came nowhere near Lviv. And that's why, I didn't think that they really had much reason. They don't really have any beef with the people in Lviv. Because the Russians, like I said with Putin in his speech, that was Poland's land. Stalin shouldn't have taken it from them. And I still don't think that the Russians will want to, annex Lviv. Certainly that would never happen. I shouldn't say never, but I think that that's extremely unlikely and would not be in the Russians' self-interest. And that's really the lens that I'm looking at this through. What is in the Russian self-interest? What's in Putin's political self-interest? I said yesterday that as more blood and treasure is spent and expended on this war, the more spoils I think Putin will be expected to bring home to Mother Russia. I think that his constituents want to feel that whatever costs were incurred by this war were ultimately worth it. They want, their dead loved ones, who might be soldiers who have perished in this war, or just taxpayers whose, money has been expended on this. They want to feel like they got their money's worth. And so at this point, at the very least, the Russians are going to go all the way to Transnistria. They're going to connect Transnistria with Russia. All of that part of Ukraine, that coastline that separates Moldova from the Black Sea, that is going to be under Russian influence, if not flying the Russian flag directly. The people loyal to Russia and Transnistria will be connected directly to the Russian state. And in time, Moldova, I think, will fall under Russian influence, even though, the media at this point likes to call it a Western-leaning former Soviet republic. I just don't think that that's sustainable in a place like Moldova. I think that if the West wanted to bring Moldova in under the West sphere of influence, their best bet would have been very early on to reunify Moldova with the Romanian state. But for historical reasons that I'm not well versed enough in to understand, there seems to be a lot of resistance to that in Moldova, and they very much consider themselves to be different from Romania, kind of like in the way that you have Ukrainians and Russians, and the Ukrainian nationalists want to think of themselves very different from Russians. And historically, people outside of Russia and Ukraine and the Soviet Union kind of would have thought of Ukrainians as Russians to a great degree. Certainly, the average American would have up until the last month or so. It's kind of in the same way that Americans think of Central Americans all as Mexicans to a certain degree. You see a mestizo-looking guy speaking Spanish, you go, "Oh, that's a Mexican." Even though, a Guatemalan, a Salvadoran, these people are not Mexicans. A Panamanian, certainly, far from a Mexican. And so I think that ultimately the future of Moldova is going to be tied to that question of identity. It's a matter of differentiating themselves from Romania. And the more that they want to differentiate themselves from Romania, I think the more that they will be driven into the arms of the Russians, because Romania is so firmly now a component of NATO and the Western Bloc. Now, as this war drags on and the Russian ambitions grow, I think that the ultimate, let's not say necessarily annexation at this point, but the incorporation of Kiev back into the Russian world, the Russian sphere of influence, becomes more and more likely. Lviv is a plenty suitable candidate for capital of a Ukrainian rump state. I think that leaving Ukrainian Galicia as an independent state, as a rump, much in the same way, of the modern Austrian rump state is it's a rump of the old Austrian Empire. There was a lot of groups, ethnic groups, that wanted their piece of Austria, and what was left over was the German part, which was only kept separate from Germany in order, to weaken the Germans, and to, because it was the part that nobody else wanted, and that the winning powers of the war didn't want to give to Germany. And so I think in much the same way, Ukrainian Galicia will. And it doesn't line up entirely. It does extend to more than just Galicia, I think. I don't think it'll be that tiny, just the historic borders of Galicia, but that general area. I don't think that there will be any, that, once the Russians bite off their massive chunk of Ukraine, there's not going to be anybody left who really wants that. Like Putin floated, hey, the Poles should move in there. No, I don't think that the Poles were driven out by the Ukrainians a long time ago. I don't think that there's a lot of Poles left in that area. Certainly aren't a lot of Germans left in that area, even though once upon a time, the nobility, was German. The greatest economist of all time, Ludwig von Mises, from whom I was so greatly influenced, was actually born in Lemberg, modern-day Lviv. He was a lesser Austrian noble, meaning that I don't believe he was a landed noble, but, they did have a title of nobility, his family, and they were, German-speaking Jews. I don't think that Mises spoke Yiddish. He spoke a very thick Austrian-German accent. He learned English pretty late in life, like in his 40s or 50s, I think. Actually, it's probably 60s. I don't think he learned it until, the 40s. During the war, he had to learn English because he went from Switzerland to New York. So it's actually pretty impressive that he was able to speak English that well, and be intelligible for learning it that late. But I don't want to get off on that. But my point is, the groups who maybe historically would have wanted to stake a claim to this land are no longer around. The Ukrainians are the only game left in town. They, largely ethnically purified that area. I don't really know. I mean, I think that maybe they were the dominant group to begin with, and but it used to be a much more ethnically diverse region. And that really was the nature of the Austrian Empire. It's something that I actually admired about it. I thought that it was very interesting. Even though I consider myself more of an anarchist, I don't like the idea of the state. There was something that was so honest about the Austrian Empire, about how, hey, we don't claim to be a nation state. We don't claim to be like your true leaders of you, the Croats, or the Germans, or the Jews, or the Ukrainians, or the Poles. We're the state. If you're loyal to us, it's because, you think we do a good job. You pay your taxes on time, and you're not going to have a problem with us. It was a very honest sort of statism. They didn't really, care. They didn't try and, couch their conquests in terms of like, oh, we need to provide living space for our, ethnic brethren. So they're just like, no, we want to gobble up more territory. Why do we want Bosnia? Because we can take it. Because the Turks are retreating, and we can go in there and fill the vacuum and take over Bosnia. I miss the days of old school honest imperialism. Not that I like imperialism, but just that, I'm just disgusted by, the cover, the whole, the democracy and human rights and all of this BS. Nobody believes in that. Nobody in power, at least. When it's convenient to favor popular sovereignty because you want to break up Serbia, what the West says is most important is, oh, well, what do the people there think? What are they, blah, blah, blah. The Serbs are bad. They're beating down on a minority group. And then when it's convenient to favor, territorial sovereignty, then of course Ukraine is, oh my gosh, it's the eternal, inviolable borders of Ukraine that we must defend. We don't care how many people die, in this border dispute. We don't care that there are people there in the east who don't want to live under the rule of Kiev. And then, of course, the Russians can come in and say, oh, well, we're just, we're trying to intervene in a genocide, and, we're going to, get rid of the Nazi administration. Of course, there are real Nazis there. But, when you have two sides in a war like this and they're trying to propagandize their own people and foreigners, things are never the other side's never as bad as they say. The Ukrainian military is, heavily influenced by their Nazi faction, but it's not like the Third Reich. It's not quite at that level. That's not to say that it's good. It's not to say that they aren't a problem. They're a huge problem. I mean, everybody was honest about that before this year. It was not controversial. You could read about it in Western news sources. You can still find their old articles. People in the West used to acknowledge, oh yeah, neo-Nazis in Ukraine, it's a problem. But of course, now that Putin says it's a problem, all of a sudden it's not a problem. Nazis? What Nazis? I've never heard of these Nazis. That's crazy. That's World War II stuff. Or, the 1940s called. They want their foreign policy back. And so it's all so frustrating. And so that's why there's no real reason for the Russians to compromise. The Russians at this stage are incentivized to take as much as they want, because they can. They gain nothing diplomatically by settling for less. At this point, if they just take Donbass and keep Crimea, things aren't going to be any better for them than if they took all the land from Donbass to Transnistria. And that's why I kind of waver over the issue of Kiev. Do the Russians need Kiev? No. If they wanted to set up, a puppet regime in, let's call it Novorossiya, the more Russian friendly, or the more Russian, what do I call it? Russian tolerant parts of Ukraine, Russian affiliated, Russified parts of Ukraine. They already have Kharkov. Kharkov at one point was the capital of the Ukrainian SSR. Um, and so it would make a fine capital for Novorossiya if they wanted to create a breakaway state. They don't need Kiev. But at this point, why not take Kiev? From what we understand, the strategy of the Russians of evacuating these cities is working. Kiev's mostly emptied out. And so the Russians very easily, if they capture, I shouldn't say very easily. That's, it's an absurd thing to say in a war. There's nothing easy about war. It's terrible. If they're able to capture Kiev, which they will, if they want to, the people who who are patriotic Ukrainians or whatever who hate Russia, they're not going to come back. The people who will come back are the people who either like Russia or don't care, and then the people who move, new people who move there will be people who like Russia. Honestly, at this point, the Russians just need a defensible border with this Galician state, or with this Galician region, so that they can, leave that as a rump state. Turn it into, as Alexander Mercurius has said, the Idlib of Ukraine, and just, keep their weapons pointed at it, and, make sure that they don't cross over into, the Russian part of Ukraine. And I think long term they'll probably have, they'll probably be pretty effective in governing it. And by that I mean that there won't be an Afghanistan situation. People who compare Afghanistan to Ukraine and say, oh, well, we can just create an Afghanistan in Ukraine, probably don't understand what made Afghanistan Afghanistan. Afghanistan's a completely different place than Ukraine. And so they have different problems, and you can, tame them effectively in different ways. I talked about, I think, how a way in which Afghanistan could be a more peaceful place, but it's very different from, what I think, would need to be done in order to pacify Ukraine. I mean, this war is allowing the Russians to politically cleanse Ukraine under the auspices of humanitarian corridors. And I'm surprised this isn't something that the media in the West hasn't picked up on, because it's pretty smart. And if I were in the Western media, I'd be trying to tie Putin to Milosevic, not Hitler. Of course, they all try to tie Milosevic to Hitler, I guess. So that's not but I mean, they've done a good enough job over the past couple decades, or almost 3 decades at this point, of demonizing Milosevic on his own. I think that, although I have to say the average American has no idea who he is still. But they know the phrase ethnic cleansing. They could say humanitarian corridors equal ethnic cleansing, therefore we have to shut down the humanitarian corridors, which reportedly Azov has tried to do consistently throughout this whole Mariupol siege. I don't know, the extent of that, how true that is. Would it shock me from the Azov guys? No. Would it shock me from, the regular Ukrainian army? Yeah, that I would think would be a little far-fetched. But from the Azov guys, it wouldn't shock me. It's just like with World War II. You would expect the worst atrocities to be committed by the Waffen-SS, not by the Wehrmacht. But at the end of the day, these humanitarian corridors are Russia's key to victory, and the key to Ukraine's defeat. You want to drive the people who don't like you out of these areas as peacefully as possible. That's the most efficient thing to do. You want to use the threat of force. You don't want to actually have to exert much force. Of course, they are exerting force. There are plenty of instances have been recorded in which civilians have been killed or injured. That happens in wars. The question is never, are civilians being killed? The question is always, to what degree they're being killed. So anyway, as long as there is some safe haven for Ukrainians who don't like Russia, just as there was a safe haven in Syria for jihadis, I think that this is going to be an effective strategy. Leaving that rump will enable them to do this. They're going to be able to ship all these people in there. And that's already what we're seeing. You know, the more millions of refugees that you hear about, people who have been internally displaced inside of Ukraine, all of that is to Russia's advantage. That's exactly, you know, if I were in Putin's position, and this isn't something that I want to do, again, this isn't something that I would do if I were in Putin's position. It would make me sick to my stomach. I wouldn't be able to sleep at night if I were doing this. And again, that's not to condemn him even necessarily. I don't want to. I'm not trying to play the fence sitter here. That's honestly my position. I'm not willing to take a side on this. But given if I were already, if you swap bodies with me with Putin today, my goal would be to displace the people who hate me in Ukraine, and therefore pacify the territory. You know, and maybe that's just my American instincts kicking in, because that's exactly what my forefathers did here to the native population. The pre-Columbian population, we'll call it that. The native isn't really right, because if I'm not a Native American, what the hell am I? What we call the Indians, but when talking about foreign affairs, I don't want to call them Indians, because then people think I'm talking about Narendra Modi and the Hindus. But the American Indians were uprooted. They were driven out, of course, quite violently over many, many decades and well over 8 centuries. They were pushed out into and corralled onto reservations. And that's essentially how I see Galicia in Ukraine today. It's one great big Ukrainian reservation. Not to say that there won't be Ukrainians left in the parts of Ukraine which Russia will dominate here moving forward, but the Ukrainians there will be people who either don't hate Russia or to affirmatively like Russia. The Ukrainians who hate Russia and don't want anything to do with Russia will have a reservation in the West. And any Ukrainian nationalists who are caught off the reservation, let's say waging some kind of insurgency in the Russian sectors of Ukraine, will be, I think, able to be dealt with. But who knows? I mean, if these people are truly unwilling to leave, or if they're able to sneak back in, because that's the thing, I think that once this war is over and the fighters are cleaned up, think about all the fighters, the people who are willing to really dig in and fight till the death, will do so in this war. This is their moment. I think that those kinds of guys will not be left over in the country after the war. They won't be there to wage the insurgency, because those will have to be people who choose to come back. And the people who didn't already fight this war to the death, why would they want to come back into the Russian-held parts of Ukraine behind enemy territory and then wage an insurgency? Just doesn't make sense to me. Now is the moment to make your last stand, if you're of that mind. It's not like the Russians swiftly moved in and captured the cities overnight, and then all of a sudden now they have to wage an insurgency. They are fighting the insurgency essentially already before it even starts. If they moved more quickly and just tried to seize the cities and raise the Russian flag, sure, they would have they have a victory, but then they would be surrounded in all these places by people who hate them. This war is demonstrating potentially. Now, we'll see how it works out long term. But the way it looks to me, and to many others who, that's why I don't, I'm not a totally original thinker on this stuff. I'm trying to watch and listen to a lot of other people who are watching this too, who I respect as independent analysts, see what their thoughts are. It really looks like the way that this war is being waged, it is, the operation of so-called denazification and demilitarization is, it's a process of Russification. Or at least it's creating a potential, an opening for Russification, in that, what is left of Ukraine will be able to function as a part of Russia. So, with that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow.